January 31st, 1945. Clark Air Base, Luzon. Major Frank T. McCoy of the U.S. Army Air Forces stood before an abandoned Japanese bomber, camera in hand, hardly believing what he saw. The aircraft gleamed in the tropical sunlight. An intact Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, tail number 763-12. Its smooth, tubular fuselage and slender wings gave it the unmistakable look that Allied pilots had nicknamed the flying cigar. But what stunned McCoy was not its elegant form. It was what he found inside. Through inspection panels in the wings, McCoy discovered fuel tanks made of nothing but thin aluminum, just 2 millimeters thick. No armor plating, no self-sealing compounds, no fire suppression system. Just thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel sitting vulnerable beneath the skin. This was not negligence, it was design. And it revealed something extraordinary. Japan's entire bomber philosophy had been built on a gamble. That speed and range mattered more than survival. That discovery traced back to December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. As the smoke still rose from Oahu, 82 G4M Betty bombers and 26 G3M Nell bombers lifted off from bases in Formosa, heading straight for Clark Field in the Philippines. At 12:35 p.m., flying at 20,000 feet, unprecedented distances. By December 1941, 180 Bettys were in service, and they performed brilliantly, as long as no one shot back. But when American air power recovered, those design compromises became deadly. Guadalcanal proved it beyond doubt. Of 100 Betty bombers committed to the campaign, nearly all were destroyed, taking hundreds of airmen with them. Few ever made it home once hit. Japanese engineers tried to fix the problem. In 1943, they added thin 30-millimeter rubber sheets under the wings. It made almost no difference. In 1944, the G4M3 model introduced true self-sealing tanks, but it came at the cost of 2,000 kilometers of range. Flying at 20,000 feet beyond the reach of American anti-aircraft guns, they unleashed 636 bombs across the airfield. Within minutes, Zero fighters dove in to strafe what was left. In under an hour, American air power in the Philippines was crippled. The attack marked the operational debut of the Betty, and its performance was astonishing. Flying nearly 500 miles from Formosa, the Japanese bombers struck targets no other nation's aircraft could reach. 2 days later, the Betty proved its worth again. Off the coast of Malaya, 26 G4Ms joined G3Ms in attacking the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse. Flying low over shallow seas, they dropped torpedoes with surgical precision. Within 1942, over Guadalcanal, 23 Betty bombers took off from Rabaul to attack American positions. Only 5 returned. The rest exploded mid-air after only a few hits, fire consuming them in seconds. Pilots began calling them flying lighters, one-shot cigars, Zippos. Even glancing rounds set them ablaze. When Australian forces captured the Buna airfield later that year, Allied engineers finally saw why. Bettys recovered from the field revealed shocking simplicity. Fuel tanks without any sealing material or protection. Engineers in the Technical Air Intelligence Unit concluded this was no field modification. It was deliberate. Japanese designers had sacrificed every ounce of armor and protection to gain range and speed. Where American bombers like the B-17 and B-24 carried layers of self-sealing rubber and steel protection, the Betty carried none. The weight savings, roughly 500 kilograms, allowed it to fly over 3,700 miles, an extraordinary feat for a twin-engine aircraft. But that same decision turned every hit into a death sentence. To understand why, one had to go back to 1937, when Japan's Navy issued the requirements that would define the G4M. The bomber had to fly nearly 3,700 kilometers carrying a torpedo, or over 4,700 empty. Far beyond the American fighters dominated the skies. Barely 60 were built before the war ended. The Betty's fatal weakness was on full display on April 18, 1943, when it carried Japan's most famous commander to his death. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, boarded a Betty at Repulse. U.S. intelligence intercepted his flight plan, and 16 P-38 Three-late Lightnings flew over 400 miles to intercept him. The American fighters arrived exactly on time. They attacked the formation, and within moments Yamamoto's Betty burst into flames. Its fuel tanks ignited instantly. He died on impact. The vulnerability that had haunted Japanese crews now claimed the Empire's most irreplaceable strategist. 2 years later, that same vulnerability led to another disaster. On March 21, 1945, 18 Betty bombers took off carrying piloted rocket bombs called Ohka. Desperate suicide weapons meant to strike American ships off Okinawa. Burdened by the heavy rockets, the Bettys could barely maneuver. American Hellcats intercepted them 100 miles out. Every single bomber was destroyed before reaching range. None of the Ohka weapons were ever launched. Over 150 Japanese aviators died in that single mission. Yet even in defeat, the Betty remained part of history's final chapter. On August 19, 1945, 4 days after Emperor Hirohito and 90 minutes, both British capital ships were gone. The first in history sunk solely by air power while maneuvering at sea. To Japan, the Betty had become a symbol of technological triumph. Light, long-ranged, and devastating. Across early 1942, its raids reached Darwin, Australia, from 1,500 miles away. They struck Port Moresby and Guadalcanal. No Allied bomber came close to matching its range. But as the months passed, the Betty's miracle began to unravel. By mid-1942, new American fighters, Hellcats, Corsairs, and improved P-38s filled the Pacific skies. They were faster, tougher, and far deadlier. On August 8, Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. 2 white-painted Betty bombers bearing green crosses lifted off from Atsugi Air Base. Call signs Baton 1 and Baton 2, they carried Japanese delegates to surrender negotiations with Allied forces. Escorted by American fighters, they flew unarmed, engines humming over the same skies where the war had begun. The symbolism was unmistakable. The bomber that had once opened Japan's war of conquest now carried its peace. By war's end, Mitsubishi had built over 2,400 Betty bombers. Fewer than a handful survived. The rest were burned, destroyed in combat, or scrapped in defeat. The aircraft's range had been unmatched, but its protection nearly non-existent. For every flight, the price was blood. Thousands of Japanese aviators died inside Betty bombers, victims not of cowardice or incompetence, but of engineering choices that valued performance over life. Survivors would later call it a beautiful death machine, an aircraft that demanded sacrifice for speed. Major McCoy's report from Clark Air Base confirmed what the Allies had come to suspect. The Betty was a masterpiece of efficiency, but also a monument to fatal trade-offs. It embodied Japan's wartime strategy, audacious, daring, but unsustainable against an enemy with overwhelming industrial power, and a doctrine that valued survival as much as range. The G4M had changed far the Pacific in its early months. Any Western aircraft. Japan's vast Pacific Empire demanded such range to project power from Formosa to the Philippines, from the home islands to New Guinea. The Navy's engineers at Mitsubishi, led by Kiro Honjo, faced an impossible equation. The more fuel you carried, the heavier the plane became. The more armor and self-sealing protection you added, the shorter the range. Something had to give. Honjo made the choice that would haunt Japan's airmen. Protection would be sacrificed for performance. The first prototype flew in 1939 and exceeded all expectations. It was light, just 6.7 tons empty, and with over 4,700 liters of fuel, changed the Pacific in its early months. But by the end, it symbolized Japan's decline, a nation that reached far, but built too thin to endure the fire it would face. In the end, the Betty's story is one of brilliance and tragedy, of engineers who achieved the impossible and pilots who paid the price. When the white-painted Bettys touched down in August 1945, the circle was complete. The same wings that had brought destruction to Clark Field 4 years earlier now carried the message of surrender, and beneath their gleaming aluminum skins still lay the same unprotected fuel tanks. Silent reminders of the choices that had defined Japan's war and its defeat.